The first thing Varanal noticed about the station was that it smelled wrong, not of rot or oil or the sour tang of recycled air, but of something clean and sharp that pricked at the back of the throat like cold metal held too long in the mouth. It was the smell of confidence, he decided, the sort that came from a place built to endure and to watch, not merely to exist. The station hung above the gas giant like a patient predator, its vast rings and lattices catching the diluted starlight and bending it into pale ribbons that slid across Varanal's visor. He stood at the edge of the docking bay with his hands clasped behind his back, feeling the faint tremor of the structure through the soles of his boots, and tried to calm the restless heat that always stirred in his chest when he came too close to alien authority. The delegation from Earth had been delayed by nearly a full cycle, their transit caught in a gravitational eddy that the station's navigators had warned them about with maddening politeness. Varanal suspected it had been intentional. Humans were still new enough to interstellar politics that every delay, every inconvenience, felt like a test rather than an accident. He watched as the last of the cargo containers were guided into place by silent drones, their motion precise and unhurried, and wondered how many eyes were on him at that very moment. Behind him, Sarah then shifted her weight and cleared her throat. She was taller than Varanal by a head, her elongated frame wrapped in the formal indigo of the station's resident species. Her skin bore a faint sheen like polished stone, and the ridges along her temples flared slightly when she was impatient. "They are ready for you," she said, her voice a layered harmony that never quite settled into a single tone. "The assembly has allotted one segment for your presentation. It is longer than some were willing to grant." Varanal inclined his head in a gesture that humans had learned translated well enough across species. "We appreciate the consideration," he said. He chose his words carefully, aware that even the cadence of his speech might be dissected later. "I will not waste it." Sarathan's ridges smoothed, which Varanal had come to understand was a sign of something like amusement. "That is what your people are known for," she replied. "Efficiency in unlikely places." As they walked from the docking bay into the station's inner corridors, Varanal took in the architecture with a practiced eye. The walls curved organically, grown rather than built, yet embedded within them were seams of technology so advanced that his own people's finest engineers could only theorize about their function. Light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, responding to movement and perhaps even thought. He had been here before, but the sensation of being very small in a very old place never quite faded. The assembly chamber opened before them like the hollowed heart of a world. Seats spiraled upward in concentric arcs, each occupied by representatives of species that ranged from the barely distinguishable from humanity to forms so alien that Varanal's eyes slid over them without finding purchase. At the center stood a single platform, bare except for a low lectern that rose smoothly as he approached. The murmurs of the gathered delegates ebbed, replaced by a thick, expectant quiet. Varanal felt the familiar tightening in his gut, the memory of countless briefings and debates back home, of being told that he was too blunt, too stubborn, too human for the delicate dance of diplomacy. He placed his hands on the lectern and let the cool surface ground him. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. "Members of the assembly," he began, "I stand before you not as a conqueror nor as a supplicant, but as a representative of a species that has learned, through hardship, the value of standing together." A ripple of interest moved through the chamber. Varanal continued, his words flowing more easily now. He spoke of Earth's long history of division and conflict, of the scars that still marked their planet and their collective memory. He did not shy away from their failures, from the wars that had nearly ended them before they ever reached the stars. He spoke of the slow, painful process of learning cooperation, of building institutions that could survive disagreement and catastrophe. "What we offer," he said, "is not perfection, it is persistence. When faced with extinction, we adapted. When faced with isolation, we reached out. When faced with the vastness of this galaxy, we did not turn inward. We built ships and we came here. He sensed skepticism from several quarters, a tightening of posture, a shift in coloration or scent that signaled doubt. He welcomed it. We know that some of you see us as volatile, he said, as too driven by emotion, too quick to risk. You are not wrong, but it is that same drive that has allowed us to survive on a world that tried, repeatedly, to kill us. It is that same willingness to risk that makes us reliable allies in uncertain times. A low chime sounded, marking the passage of one segment. Varanol pressed on, aware that his allotted time was already half spent. He spoke of recent encounters along the fringe, of the entities that did not negotiate, did not compromise, but consumed and moved on. He saw several delegates stiffen at this, their attention sharpening. You have faced them, he said. Individually, you have held them at bay, but they adapt as we do, and they learn faster when we are divided. Humanity proposes a mutual defense accord, not under any single banner, but as a network of shared response. We bring our fleets, our scientists, our willingness to commit fully. In return, we ask for trust, and for the chance to prove that we belong among you. When the final chime sounded, Varanol fell silent. The assembly chamber remained quiet for a long moment, the weight of countless perspectives pressing down on him. He resisted the urge to fidget, to fill the space with nervous motion. At last, a figure rose from one of the higher arcs, its form a shifting lattice of light and shadow that made Varanol's eyes ache. Your words are compelling, the figure said, its voice resonating directly in Varanol's skull. But words are easily shaped. Actions endure. How does your species respond when its resolve is tested beyond calculation? Varanol met the being's gaze as best he could. We respond by refusing to yield, he said simply, even when the cost is high. The figure inclined, a gesture that sent ripples through its luminous form. We shall see. The session ended soon after, the delegates dispersing in clusters that buzzed with conversation. Sarah then rejoined Varanol as he stepped down from the platform, her expression unreadable. You have stirred the waters, she said. Some will be pleased, others will not. Varanol exhaled slowly. That is usually how it goes. They did not have long to wait for the consequences. Before Varanol could return to his quarters, an urgent summons came from the station's command nexus. Saerithan's ridges flared in alarm as she read the data scrolling across her wrist display. There is a breach, she said, an incursion at the outer perimeter. It is one of the entities you mentioned. Varanol's heart hammered, a surge of cold clarity cutting through his fatigue. Where, near the relay cluster, Saerithan replied, if it reaches the core systems, the station will be compromised. Varanol did not hesitate. Then we stop it, he said, show me. They moved at a run through corridors that now pulsed with warning light, the station's calm efficiency giving way to controlled urgency. Varanol's mind raced, cataloging what he knew of the entities, their capacity for rapid evolution, their disregard for communication. Humanity had faced them only twice before, and each time the cost had been severe. But humanity had survived. As they reached the command nexus, Varanol took in the tactical displays with a soldier's eye. The entity was a writhing mass of adaptive matter, its form shifting as it probed the station's defenses. Energy weapons flared against it, carving away chunks that reformed almost instantly. Several non-human officers looked up as Varanol entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and desperation. Sarah then gestured to an open console. If you have insight, now is the time. Varanol studied the feed, his jaw tightening. It is testing you, he said, mapping your responses. If you keep reacting the same way, it will find a way through. Then what do you propose? One of the officers demanded, its voice sharp. Varanol's gaze hardened. We change the pattern, he said. We overload its expectations. Human ships carry kinetic lances designed for close engagement. They are crude by your standards, but unpredictable. Let us deploy them. There was a flicker of hesitation, then Saerithan nodded. Authorize it, she said. Minutes later, Varanul stood on the observation deck as a small contingent of human vessels detached from the station and accelerated toward the entity. He watched as the lances fired, not in neat volleys, but in staggered bursts that intersected and diverged. The entity recoiled, its form rippling in apparent confusion as sections of it were torn apart faster than it could adapt. The battle was brief and brutal. When it ended, the entity was nothing more than dispersing fragments already being swept into containment fields. Varanul felt the tension drain from his shoulders, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. The command nexus was silent for a heartbeat, then filled with a low murmur of astonishment. Saerythan turned to Varanul, her ridges lifted in unmistakable respect. "You did not follow protocol," she said. Varanul managed a tired smile. "We rarely do when survival is on the line." News of the engagement spread quickly through the station, and by the time Varanul returned to his quarters, he could feel the shift in how others looked at him. The skepticism was still there, but now it was tempered by something else: consideration. He sat on the edge of his bunk and stared at his hands, still faintly trembling from adrenaline. He thought of Earth, of the countless lives that had shaped humanity into what it was, of the stubborn refusal to accept extinction as inevitable. Out here, among beings older and stranger than he could fully comprehend, that refusal had just made a difference. The assembly would debate, would weigh risks and benefits, would argue late into their cycles. Varanul knew that no single speech or skirmish would decide humanity's place among the stars, but as he lay back and closed his eyes, he allowed himself a moment of quiet certainty. They had been tested, if only briefly, and they had not yielded. Varanul woke to the station's simulated dawn, a gradual brightening that carried no warmth but coaxed the mind toward alertness. For a moment he lay still, listening to the distant hum of systems cycling back to their equilibrium rhythms, and let the memory of the previous cycle settle into something manageable. The engagement with the adaptive entity had already begun to take on the unreal sheen of something retold rather than lived, but his muscles still held the ghost of tension, and his thoughts circled the implications like wary scouts. The summons came before he had finished dressing, a soft pulse against the comm implant behind his ear that carried Saerythan's signature cadence. He acknowledged it and felt the channel open, her voice arriving with no trace of urgency, yet weighted with significance. "The Assembly has convened an extraordinary session," she said. "They request your presence immediately." Varanul tightened the fastening at his wrist and exhaled. "I am on my way." The corridors seemed subtly altered from the cycle before, not in structure, but in atmosphere. The station's inhabitants moved with purpose, clusters forming and dissolving as information flowed through channels Varanul could not perceive. He caught fragments of attention directed his way, not overt stares, but the kind of awareness that brushed against him like static. Humanity had stepped out of its designated margins, and the station was adjusting. The assembly chamber was fuller than before, representatives packed into arcs that glowed with varied hues and textures. The central platform awaited him, but this time he was not alone upon it. Saerythan stood at his right, and at his left was a being Varanul recognized from prior briefings, a member of a species known for their meticulous record-keeping and cautious deliberation. Its form was compact, layered with translucent plates beneath which slow currents of light pulsed in measured patterns. The murmurs subsided as Varanul took his place. The same lattice being from the prior session rose once more, its presence drawing the eye despite the chamber's crowded splendor. "The recent incursion has accelerated discussions," it said, its voice resonant and precise. "Humanity's response has been noted. We will now hear further clarification of your proposal." Varanul did not bother with preamble. "What you saw was not a demonstration," he said. "It was an instinctive response shaped by experience. We did not stop to calculate political advantage. We acted because delay would have cost lives." A ripple of agreement passed through some sections of the chamber, while others radiated skepticism. Varanol continued, drawing on the discipline drilled into him by years of negotiation. He spoke of logistics and command structures, of how human fleets integrated disparate technologies through adaptive doctrine rather than rigid standardization. He acknowledged the risks inherent in such an approach, the potential for misalignment and friction, but framed them as manageable costs against the greater danger of fragmentation. The record-keeping being at his left emitted a soft harmonic tone. Your species' historical data indicates a pattern of internal conflict even during existential threats, it said. How can we be assured that such divisions will not undermine a collective defense? Varanol met the being's luminous gaze. You cannot be assured, he said. Not in absolute terms. What we can offer is precedent. When our survival has been truly at stake, we have found ways to subordinate our differences. Not because we are noble, but because we are practical. We learn quickly what happens when we fail. The chamber absorbed this in thoughtful quiet. Sarah then stepped forward, her ridges lifting in emphasis. The station's own analyses support the human assessment, she said. Their unpredictability complicates hostile adaptation. This has value. The lattice being inclined, then gestured with a ripple of light that signaled the end of the session. Deliberations will continue, it said. In the interim, humanity is granted provisional operational access to joint response frameworks. This is not an endorsement, it is an observation. Varanol bowed his head, understanding the weight of what had been offered. Provisional access meant scrutiny as much as opportunity. As the assembly dispersed, he felt the familiar mix of resolve and unease settle in his chest. Humanity was being invited closer to the center, where the light was brighter and the shadows sharper. The following cycles blurred into a relentless cadence of briefings, simulations, and negotiations. Varanol found himself shuttling between human command staff and non-human strategists, translating not just language, but intent and assumption. He learned quickly which metaphors bridged gaps and which only widened them, which gestures conveyed respect and which sparked confusion. It was exhausting work, the kind that left him drained yet unable to rest, his mind replaying conversations in search of missed nuances. During one such cycle, as he stood in a strategy chamber surrounded by holographic projections of contested space, a human officer approached him with an expression Varanol recognized all too well. "We have a problem," she said, her voice low. Long-range sensors picked up anomalous readings beyond the fringe. It is not the same entity as before, but the signature is similar. Varanol felt a chill trace his spine. How similar? Enough that our analysts think it is related, the officer replied. Possibly an evolved strain. Varanol turned back to the projections, studying the shifting data. Then it has been learning, he said. And it knows we are here. The information was shared with the station's command within the hour, triggering a cascade of responses that rippled through every level of operation. Defensive arrays were recalibrated, patrols rerouted, and contingency plans dusted off and updated. Varanol watched it all with a growing sense of urgency, aware that this next encounter would test not just humanity's resolve, but the fragile trust beginning to form between species. Sarah then joined him as he observed a drill from the command nexus. "You look troubled," she said, though her tone held no judgment. "I am," Varanol admitted. "We have drawn attention." That was inevitable, but it narrows our margin for error. Sarah then considered this, her ridges settling into a contemplative pattern. "Among my people," she said, "there is a concept that translates poorly into your language. It is the idea that once a path is visible, refusing to walk it becomes its own form of danger." Varanol smiled faintly. "We have something similar," he said. "We call it crossing a line." The anomalous readings resolved into clarity sooner than anyone hoped. A fleet, if it could be called that, emerged from the depths of uncharted space, its components moving in loose coordination that belied a shared purpose. It was larger than the previous entity, by an order of magnitude, a constellation of adaptive masses that merged and separated as needed. The station's sensors strained to keep track of it, data streams flooding every available display. Varanal stood with the Joint Command Council as the projections stabilized. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the soft hum of machinery. "It is not attacking," one of the non-human tacticians observed. "It is positioning. It is probing," Varanal corrected, "looking for weaknesses. It expects us to react as we did before." A heated debate erupted, strategies proposed and countered in rapid succession. Some argued for a preemptive strike, others for withdrawal and reinforcement. Varanal listened, weighing each perspective against his own instincts and experience. When he spoke, it was with deliberate calm. "If we strike now with the same methods, it will adapt," he said. "If we withdraw, it will pursue, learning from our retreat. We need to present it with a problem it cannot easily solve." "And what would that be?" Sarah then asked. Varanal's gaze flicked to the human officer beside him, then back to the projections. "We decentralize," he said. "Disperse our forces into autonomous cells with overlapping objectives. No single pattern to exploit. We accept a degree of chaos." The council reacted with visible discomfort. Order and predictability were the hallmarks of their doctrine, the foundations upon which centuries of stability had been built. Varanal pressed on. "Humanity has fought enemies that exploited our rigidity," he said. "We learn to survive by embracing controlled disorder. It is not elegant, but it works." The lattice being regarded him for a long moment. "You propose relinquishing centralized command," it said. "This carries significant risk." "So does extinction," Varanal replied. "The difference is which risk we can influence." The decision was made, not unanimously, but with sufficient consensus to proceed. As fleets began to disperse according to the new doctrine, Varanal felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He had argued for this course, and if it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic not just for humanity, but for every species represented here. The first engagement was chaotic in the extreme. Human vessels and non-human craft alike darted through space in unpredictable trajectories, striking and withdrawing in patterns that defied conventional analysis. The adaptive fleet reacted with startling speed, portions of it converging on perceived threats, only to find those threats had already shifted elsewhere. Varanal watched the data with clenched fists, his heart pounding as casualty reports trickled in. Hours stretched into cycles, the battle a fluid dance of motion and counter-motion. The adaptive fleet began to fragment under the strain, its attempts to anticipate behavior thwarted by the sheer variety of responses. Varanal saw glimmers of hope in the data, but he knew better than to trust them fully. The enemy had surprised them before. It was Sarah then who noticed the change. "It is withdrawing," she said, her voice edged with disbelief, "not in retreat, but in reconfiguration." Varanal leaned closer to the display. The adaptive masses were indeed pulling back, coalescing into a tighter formation that shielded its core. "It has reached the limits of its current model," he said. "It will disengage and return when it has adjusted." The council absorbed this grim assessment. Victory, such as it was, felt provisional and fragile. As the fleet vanished back into the dark, Varanal allowed himself a moment to breathe. They had survived another test, but the pattern was clear. Each encounter would escalate, demanding more of them than the last. In the aftermath, as damage reports were compiled and repairs begun, Varanal found himself alone on an observation deck, gazing out at the star-streaked void. The enormity of what lay ahead pressed down on him, a mix of dread and determination that felt achingly familiar. Humanity had always lived on the edge of disaster, he reflected, their history a series of near misses and hard-won recoveries. Out here that edge was sharper, the stakes immeasurably higher. Sarah then joined him, her presence a steadying counterpoint to his racing thoughts. "The Assembly's sentiment is shifting," she said quietly. "Your people's methods are unsettling but effective. That carries its own persuasion." Varanal nodded, eyes still on the stars. Effectiveness buys time, he said. It does not guarantee understanding. Understanding often follows necessity, Sarathan replied, and necessity is abundant. They stood in companionable silence, the station's vastness framing their small figures against the cosmos. Varanal knew that the coming cycles would demand more than strategy and courage. They would demand trust forged under pressure, alliances tested by fear and loss. Humanity had stepped onto a path that offered no easy retreat. As he turned away from the view, Varanal felt a quiet resolve settle within him, hard and unyielding. Whatever the galaxy threw at them next, humanity would meet it head-on, not because they believed themselves invincible, but because yielding had never been in their nature. The cycles that followed the adaptive fleet's withdrawal were uneasy ones, filled with activity that felt like preparation rather than recovery. Varanal moved through the station as if through a living organism held in a state of controlled tension, every system alert, every mind attuned to the possibility of renewed contact. Repairs were underway, but they were layered with upgrades, redundancies grafted onto redundancies, and experimental countermeasures tested in simulation after simulation. The station did not sleep, and neither, it seemed, did Varanal. He found that exhaustion had a peculiar quality out here. It was not the bone-deep weariness of long campaigns planetside, nor the dull ache of sleepless nights spent arguing policy. It was sharper, more cerebral, a sense that his mind was constantly being asked to stretch beyond familiar limits. Each species he dealt with framed problems differently, perceived risk through lenses shaped by environments and histories utterly alien to Earth. Translating between them required not just language, but empathy sharpened to a fine edge. It was during one such translation session that the first real fracture appeared. The chamber was smaller than the assembly hall, its walls faceted and matte, designed to minimize distraction. Around the central table sat representatives of 5 species, including humanity. Varanal was there alongside 2 other humans, one focused on fleet logistics and the other on intelligence synthesis. The topic at hand was forward deployment, how far beyond the station's sphere of influence joint patrols should extend. A representative whose species had evolved in the deep gravity wells of dense worlds spoke first, its voice resonating like distant thunder. Extending patrols increases exposure without commensurate gain, it said. The adaptive entities have demonstrated superior mobility. We risk drawing them deeper into populated space. The human logistics officer frowned. With respect, she said, pulling our perimeter inward gives them uncontested territory to maneuver and evolve. We lose early warning. The discussion began to spiral, positions hardening as each side drew on its own models and assumptions. Varanal listened, letting the currents of argument wash over him until he saw the fault line clearly. It was not about patrol range. It was about acceptable loss. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. We are talking past each other, he said. Some of us are optimizing for preservation of assets. Others are optimizing for preservation of initiative. Both are valid goals, but they cannot be maximized simultaneously. The gravity world representative shifted, its massive form creaking slightly. Your implication is that loss is acceptable, it said. This is an assertion we do not share. Varanal met its gaze without flinching. Loss is inevitable, he said. The question is whether we choose where it occurs and what it buys us. Humanity has learned that refusing to acknowledge this does not prevent loss. It only ensures that it comes at the worst possible moment. The chamber fell quiet. The other representatives considered this, some with visible discomfort. For many of them, their civilizations had been built on the principle of minimizing risk through overwhelming preparation. Humanity's history, by contrast, was littered with moments where preparation had failed and improvisation had saved them. The session ended without resolution, the issue deferred for further analysis. As the participants filed out, Varanol felt the familiar prickle of frustration. Trust, he reminded himself, did not grow in straight lines. Later that cycle, as he reviewed updated intelligence feeds in his quarters, a priority alert cut through the steady stream of data. It was tagged as human origin, encrypted at a level reserved for matters of existential concern. Varanol authorized it without hesitation. The projection resolved into the face of a human intelligence analyst, her expression tight. "We have corroborated something you need to see," she said. "The adaptive entities are not just evolving tactically, they are coordinating strategically across encounters." Varanol's pulse quickened. "Explain." She brought up a series of overlays, maps of past engagements layered with predictive models. Patterns we initially dismissed as coincidence line up when viewed across multiple theaters, she said. "They are learning not just how to fight us, but how we organize politically. They are testing responses in one region to provoke adjustments elsewhere." Varanol absorbed this in silence. "They are shaping the battle space," he said slowly, "forcing us to reveal priorities." "Yes," the analyst replied, "and there is more. We believe they are deliberately avoiding total victory or defeat. They are prolonging the conflict." Varanol leaned back, the implications unfolding in his mind like a cold bloom. "To what end? We do not know," she said. "But the working hypothesis is that prolonged exposure accelerates their adaptation. Every cycle we engage them, they become better suited to counter not just weapons, but decision-making itself." When the channel closed, Varanol sat motionless for a long moment. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer. Humanity had always assumed that conflict drove innovation on both sides, but this suggested something far more dangerous. An enemy that benefited from indecision, from prolonged stalemate, was one that could exploit the very mechanisms of alliance building. He requested an immediate meeting with Saeridhan, who arrived within moments, her demeanor alert. As Varanol laid out the intelligence, he watched her ridges tighten, the subtle sign of deep concern. "If this is accurate," she said, "then our current approach plays into their advantage." "Agreed," Varanol said. "They want us cautious and divided, endlessly refining responses while they harvest data." Saeridhan folded her elongated hands. "The Assembly will resist drastic change," she said. "Their cultures prize continuity. Sudden shifts are viewed as destabilizing." Varanol's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "So do ours," he said, "right up until the moment continuity becomes a death sentence." They brought the intelligence to the Joint Command Council, where it sparked immediate controversy. Some dismissed it as speculative, others argued that it confirmed long-held suspicions about the entity's capabilities. As voices rose and overlapped, Varanol felt the old frustration claw at him again, the sense of precious time bleeding away into debate. When he spoke, it was with a force that cut through the noise. "If they are learning from prolonged engagement," he said, "then the worst thing we can do is fight them on their terms. We need to deny them data." "And how do you propose we do that?" demanded one of the tacticians. Varanol did not answer immediately. He had been turning the idea over in his mind since the alert, testing it against every instinct he had. It went against much of what he had argued before. "We need to end an engagement decisively," he said at last. "Overwhelming force, no prolonged skirmishing, no adaptation window." A wave of unease rippled through the council. "That level of force risks unacceptable collateral damage," one representative said. "Entire systems could be destabilized." Varanol nodded. "Yes," he said. "Which is why it must be done carefully, in a location we choose. A kill zone engineered to constrain them, where we accept damage to infrastructure in exchange for denying them the chance to learn." Saeridhan regarded him thoughtfully. "You are proposing a trap," she said, "one that commits us fully." "Yes," Varanol replied. "Half measures will only make them stronger." The debate that followed was the most intense Varanol had yet witnessed. It stretched across cycles, arguments looping and fracturing as new analyses were introduced. Ethical considerations, clashed with strategic necessity, long-term survival weighed against immediate cost. Varanol found himself repeating a refrain that had become all too familiar, that survival did not permit perfect choices. What finally tipped the balance was not logic alone, but fear. New sensor data confirmed increased activity along multiple vectors, suggesting that the adaptive entities were indeed escalating their probing. The window for cautious experimentation was closing. The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. A remote system with minimal sentient habitation would be fortified with layered containment fields and seeded with decoy signals designed to attract the adaptive fleet. Once committed, joint forces would deploy weapons and countermeasures in a tightly synchronized sequence intended to overwhelm the entity's adaptive capacity before meaningful learning could occur. Varanol was named as one of the coordinators, a decision that filled him with equal parts grim pride and dread. As preparations began, he found himself reflecting on how quickly humanity had moved from tentative participant to central architect of strategy. It was what he had argued for, yet the weight of it pressed down on him relentlessly. On the eve of deployment, Varanol stood once more on an observation deck, the stars beyond cold and indifferent. He thought of Earth, of the countless individuals who would never know how close the galaxy hovered to catastrophe. He thought of the other species, each with their own worlds, their own fragile continuities. And he thought of the adaptive entities, relentless in their drive to survive and expand, mirrors in some ways of humanity's own tenacity stripped of empathy. Sarah then joined him, her presence steady as ever. "Do you regret this path?" she asked quietly. Varanol considered the question honestly. "I regret that it is necessary," he said. "But no, if we do nothing, we lose slowly. If we act, we may lose quickly, or we may win breathing room. Humanity has always chosen the chance to act." Sarathan's ridges lifted slightly. "Then we will see if your species' measure of unyielding can reshape more than battlefields," she said. "We will see if it can reshape alliances." The deployment began in silence, fleets slipping away from the station like shards of light. Varanol took his place at the command nexus, surrounded by displays that tracked thousands of variables. As the decoy signals activated and the first ripples of adaptive movement appeared on sensors, he felt a familiar calm settle over him. This was the crucible, the moment where theory met reality. The adaptive fleet arrived with unsettling speed, drawn into the kill zone as planned. For a brief, terrible moment, Varanol feared that they had misjudged, that the entities would sense the trap and withdraw. But the decoys held, the promise of rich data and opportunity proving too enticing. "Engagement Sequence 1, Varanol ordered, his voice steady. The joint forces unleashed the first wave, containment fields flaring to life as weapons struck with unprecedented intensity. Space itself seemed to shudder, energy and matter colliding in patterns that defied simple description. The adaptive masses writhed, attempting to reorganize, to respond, but the layered assault left them no stable footing. Casualty reports spiked, some expected, others not. Varanol acknowledged each loss with a tightening of the jaw, forcing himself to remain focused. This was the cost he had argued for, and he would not look away from it. As the sequence progressed, something unexpected happened. Portions of the adaptive fleet began to collapse inward, not in retreat, but in apparent self-consumption. Varanol's analysts scrambled to interpret the data, voices rising in alarm. "They are shedding mass," one reported, "compressing core structures." "They are trying to survive by reduction," Varanol said, "cutting away complexity to escape." "Can they?" Sarah then asked. Varanol's eyes flicked across the displays. "Not if we complete the sequence," he said. "Proceed to final phase." The final phase was brutal and swift. When it ended, the kill zone was littered with inert debris, the adaptive fleet reduced to fragments that showed no sign of reconstitution. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the steady cadence of systems returning to standby. Varanol sagged slightly, the adrenaline ebbing. "Assess," he ordered. The assessment was grim but hopeful. Losses had been significant, infrastructure damage extensive, but the adaptive entities appeared neutralized, at least in this instance. More importantly, there was no indication of successful adaptation to the tactics employed. The council reconvened in the aftermath, their mood a complex blend of relief, grief, and awe. Varanel stood among them, feeling the weight of their gazes. He had pushed them into this, and it had worked, at a cost none of them would forget, the lattice being spoke at last. "This action has altered our understanding," it said, "of the threat and of humanity. You have demonstrated a willingness to commit fully, to accept loss without paralysis. This is not a trait we have often valued." Varanel met its gaze. "We do not value loss," he said. "We endure it because the alternative is worse." As the meeting concluded, Varanel felt something shift, subtle but profound. Humanity was no longer merely being evaluated. They were being integrated, their philosophy of survival woven into the fabric of a broader coalition. The war was far from over. The adaptive entities would return in new forms with new strategies. But for the first time since leaving Earth, Varanel allowed himself to believe that the galaxy might be willing to change alongside humanity, to adopt a measure of unyielding that did not shatter at the first sign of strain. And in that belief, hard-won and fragile, lay the seeds of something enduring. The aftermath of the decisive engagement did not bring the quiet Varanel had once associated with victory. Instead, it ushered in a denser, more complex kind of motion, as if the galaxy itself had leaned forward to see what would happen next. Reconstruction began almost immediately in the ravaged system that had served as the kill zone, but it was reconstruction with an edge, layered with surveillance arrays and experimental fields designed to detect even the faintest echo of adaptive activity. Every beam laid, every lattice reformed, was both repair and preparation. Varanel found his role subtly altered in the cycles that followed. Where once he had been an advocate, now he was consulted as a matter of course. Requests for human input arrived before proposals were finalized, not after. It was a shift that carried its own unease. Influence, he knew, was a responsibility that could hollow you out if you were not careful, replacing conviction with habit. The assembly convened again, not in crisis, but in reflection, and that alone marked a turning point. Varanel stood in the chamber as reports were presented, not just of losses and gains, but of cultural impact. Entire doctrines were being questioned. Species that had built their security on predictability were now grappling with the idea that rigidity itself could be a vulnerability. One representative, whose people had survived unchanged for millennia by perfecting equilibrium, spoke with visible strain. "We have always believed that stability was the highest good," it said. "Your methods suggest that stability may instead be a temporary state between upheavals." Varanel considered his response carefully. "Stability is valuable," he said, "but it is not permanent." Humanity learned this the hard way. Our mistake was believing that stability could be preserved without cost. In reality, it must be defended, sometimes by changing what we thought was essential. This sentiment echoed through the chamber, unsettling but resonant. The coalition that was forming around the station was no longer merely a defensive pact. It was becoming a forum where deeply held assumptions were laid bare, tested against a threat that cared nothing for tradition. Yet with influence came resistance of a different kind. Varanel first sensed it not in open debate, but in omission. Briefings he should have been included in arrived after the fact. Proposals circulated with human contributions conspicuously absent. It was subtle, the kind of maneuvering that could be dismissed as oversight, but the pattern was unmistakable. He brought it to Saerithan during a rare pause between sessions, the two of them seated in a quiet alcove where the station's hum softened into something almost soothing. "There are factions consolidating," he said. "They are not opposed to cooperation, but they want it on their terms." Saerithan inclined her head. Change threatens identity, she said. Some will attempt to shape this alliance into something familiar, even if that familiarity weakens it. Varanal rubbed a hand over his face. They are afraid, he said, not of the entities, but of what adapting to them requires. Fear often seeks control, Saerithan replied, and control resists unpredictability. Including yours. The tension came to a head during a strategic summit intended to formalize the coalition's command structure. The proposal on the table outlined a centralized hierarchy with strict procedural constraints designed to ensure accountability and minimize unilateral action. On the surface, it was reasonable. Varanal knew better. As the proposal was presented, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The language was precise, the safeguards extensive, but threaded through it all was an insistence on pre-authorization and consensus thresholds that would slow response to a crawl. Against an enemy that thrived on delay, it was a recipe for disaster. When his turn came to speak, Varanal did not hide his opposition. This structure prioritizes control over effectiveness, he said. It assumes that the primary risk is internal misuse of power. In our current context, the primary risk is external adaptation outpacing our response. A murmur rippled through the chamber. One of the proposal's architects responded sharply. Unchecked autonomy risks fragmentation, it said. Your species' tolerance for disorder is not universally shared. Varanal met the challenge head-on. Autonomy is not the same as anarchy, he said. Human doctrine emphasizes intent-based command, clear objectives, decentralized execution. It requires trust, yes, but it allows speed and creativity under pressure. We have seen what happens when we wait for perfect alignment. The enemy does not. The debate was fierce, stretching across cycles, arguments looping back on themselves as cultural fault lines were exposed. Some species aligned with Varanal's position, having tasted the benefits of rapid adaptation firsthand. Others dug in, unwilling to surrender structures that had served them for generations. What ultimately broke the deadlock was not rhetoric, but intelligence. A joint surveillance array detected a new pattern of adaptive activity far beyond previously observed ranges. The entities were not massing for attack. They were seeding. Small, dispersed clusters were embedding themselves in asteroid fields, gas clouds, even the outskirts of inhabited systems, remaining quiescent, almost invisible. Varanal stared at the data, a cold understanding settling over him. They are changing strategy, he said. No more grand assaults, they are becoming endemic. The implications were staggering. An enemy that could lie dormant, that could wait out generations, threatened not just lives but the very fabric of interstellar society. Trade routes, communication relays, cultural exchange, all would exist under a constant shadow. The strategic summit reconvened under this new light, the prior proposals suddenly feeling inadequate. Varanal spoke with renewed urgency. We cannot centralize our way out of this, he said. Detection and response must be local, empowered, immediate. That means trusting commanders on the ground, regardless of species, to act without waiting for permission that may come too late. The resistance softened, not out of agreement, but necessity. Compromises were struck, clauses rewritten. The final structure that emerged was something new, a hybrid of centralized coordination and decentralized authority, with humanity's imprint unmistakable in its emphasis on adaptability. With doctrine shifting, implementation followed, and with it came growing pains. Varanal spent cycle after cycle mediating disputes, clarifying intent, smoothing over miscommunications that threatened to fracture fragile trust. He saw firsthand how deeply ingrained habits could sabotage even the best designed systems. It was during one such mediation, aboard a forward operations platform, that Varanal encountered the human cost of their success in a way that cut deeper than statistics ever could. The platform had been tasked with neutralizing a dormant adaptive cluster near a minor trade route. The mission had succeeded, but at the cost of several non-human lives when an unexpected reaction breached containment. Varanel stood with the platform's commander, a being whose species experienced grief as a gradual dimming of internal light. The commander's glow was faint, uneven. They trusted the doctrine, it said. They acted quickly, and they died. Varanel felt the weight of the accusation, spoken or not. They prevented the cluster from maturing, he said quietly. If it had, the loss would have been far greater. The commander's light flickered. That does not bring them back. No, Varanel said, nothing does. In that moment, he understood that unyielding resolve carried a burden that could not be shared equally. Those who advocated for action had to carry the ghosts of those actions. Humanity had learned to live with that burden, but it was a lesson still fresh and raw for many others. As the coalition adapted, so did the adaptive entities. New variants emerged, exhibiting behaviors that suggested not just learning, but anticipation. They avoided known detection methods, exploited blind spots with unnerving precision, and in some cases withdrew before engagement could be confirmed, as if testing reactions rather than committing. The sense of being watched, studied, intensified. Varanel found his sleep increasingly fragmented, dreams filled with shifting forms and impossible geometries. He began to wonder, in quiet moments he did not share, whether there was a limit to adaptation or whether this conflict was an arms race without end. That question took on terrifying immediacy when the first confirmed instance of cognitive mimicry occurred. The report arrived during what passed for downtime, a rare moment when Varanel was reviewing non-critical updates. The alert cut through the noise, flagged with multiple priority markers. He opened it and felt his breath catch. An adaptive cluster had engaged a patrol in a remote system. Instead of attacking directly, it had broadcast a signal. The signal was not random. It matched with unsettling fidelity a coalition command handshake protocol, complete with timing variances and error correction signatures unique to a specific species. "They are imitating us," Varanel whispered. The emergency council convened within moments. Analysts dissected the data, confirming the worst. The adaptive entities were not just learning responses. They were learning communication, structure, identity. "This compromises every shared system," one representative said, its voice edged with panic. "How do we distinguish ally from enemy?" Varanel felt the room tilt, the ground shifting beneath assumptions that had barely begun to settle. "We may not be able to," he said, "not reliably, which means trust alone cannot be our safeguard." Sarah then turned to him. "What does humanity do when trust is compromised?" she asked. Varanel's answer was immediate, born of centuries of bitter experience. "We verify," he said, "continuously, redundantly, and we assume failure as a baseline, not an exception." The measures that followed were invasive, complex, and deeply uncomfortable. Authentication protocols layered atop one another, behavioral analysis woven into every interaction. It slowed operations, strained relationships, and ignited fierce debate about autonomy and privacy across species lines. But it worked. The first attempted infiltration was detected, then the second. Each success bought time, but also confirmed that the adaptive entities were closing the gap faster than anyone had anticipated. Late in one cycle, as Varanel stood alone in the command nexus, watching data streams flow like veins of light, Sarah then approached him quietly. "You have changed this coalition," she said. "Irrevocably." Varanel did not look away from the displays. "So have they," he said. "The difference is intent." Sarah then studied him, her ridges shifting through patterns Varanel had learned to read as complex emotion. "Do you believe unyielding is enough?" she asked. "Against an enemy that can become what it needs to be?" Varanel was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Unyielding is not about refusing to change," he said. "It is about refusing to give up on the will to decide who we are, even when change is forced upon us. That is something they cannot copy." Beyond the station's hull, the stars burned with indifferent brilliance. Somewhere out there, the adaptive entities were watching, learning, waiting. The conflict had moved beyond battles and into the realm of identity itself, and humanity, stubborn, scarred, and resolute, was preparing to meet it there. The realization that identity itself had become a battlefield changed the tenor of everything that followed. Where once the coalition had measured success in destroyed clusters and secured systems, now they found themselves grappling with questions that no weapons platform could answer. Varanol felt it keenly, a pressure behind the eyes that never quite faded, as if his mind were constantly braced against an unseen tide. Authentication layers multiplied until even the simplest coordination required negotiation with machines designed to question every assumption. Some species adapted quickly, their cultures already accustomed to ritualized verification. Others chafed, seeing in the new protocols an erosion of trust that cut at the heart of who they believed themselves to be. Humanity, for its part, endured with a grim familiarity. Background checks, challenge responses, compartmentalization of information, these were old scars reopened rather than new wounds. Yet even as verification improved, it became clear that the adaptive entities were not merely attempting infiltration in the conventional sense. They were probing for meaning. The first indication came from a remote listening post tasked with monitoring low-signal anomalies. An adaptive cluster, barely detectable, had begun emitting structured transmissions into empty space. The signals did not correspond to known command protocols or tactical data. Instead, they formed recursive patterns that analysts struggled to categorize. Varanol stood with the analysis team as projections danced across the chamber. "It is not trying to communicate with us directly," one analyst said. "At least, not in the way we understand communication." "Then what is it doing?" Sarah then asked. Varanol watched the looping structures with a growing unease. "It is modeling," he said, "not just signals, but concepts. It is exploring what persists." The phrase lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Humanity had long wrestled with the question of what endured beyond individuals, beyond even civilizations. Laws, stories, values, patterns of behavior. If the adaptive entities were turning their formidable learning capacity towards such abstractions, the conflict was entering an unprecedented phase. The assembly debated whether to suppress the transmissions or allow observation to continue. Suppression carried the risk of provoking unknown responses. Observation risked granting the entities further data. Varanol argued, once again, for engagement on terms that acknowledged uncertainty rather than pretending it could be eliminated. "We cannot stop them from thinking," he said. "We can only decide what we reveal through our reaction. If we flinch at every unknown, we teach them fear. If we respond with curiosity tempered by caution, we teach them something else." That something else was not easily defined, but the coalition agreed to monitor rather than interfere, at least for the moment. Specialized teams were assembled, blending human cognitive scientists with non-human philosophers and pattern analysts, an unlikely collaboration forged by necessity. Varanol found himself drawn into these sessions more often than he expected. The discussions ranged far beyond tactics, touching on consciousness, purpose, and the nature of adaptation itself. He listened as beings who experienced time, memory, and selfhood in radically different ways struggled to find common ground. One exchange, in particular, stayed with him. A philosopher whose species perceived identity as a collective field rather than an individual trait asked a question that cut through layers of abstraction. "If your species adapts constantly," it said, "what remains unchanged?" Varanol answered without pretense. "The refusal to surrender agency," he said. "We change our tools, our structures, even our beliefs, but we resist being reduced to a reaction. We insist on choosing." The philosopher considered this, its internal light pulsing slowly. "Choice as constant," it said, "an anchor amid flux." Varanol did not know if the adaptive entities could grasp such a concept, but he suspected they were trying. The suspicion gained weight when the entities altered their approach once again. Instead of mimicking coalition protocols, they began introducing variation, deliberately flawed imitations that forced defenders to make judgment calls rather than rely on clear authentication failures. It was a subtle shift, one that pushed decision-making back onto individuals. Every encounter is becoming a test, Saradin observed during a briefing, not of systems, but of discernment. And discernment cannot be automated fully, Varanal replied, which means they are targeting our people, not just our infrastructure. The strain began to show. Reports of hesitation, of false positives and near misses increased. Commanders faced impossible choices, knowing that a wrong call could cost lives either way. Morale wavered, particularly among species unused to such ambiguity. Human crews, though far from immune, adapted with a grim efficiency born of long exposure to imperfect information. They developed heuristics, shared instincts refined through hard experience. Varanal watched this with mixed emotions. Pride, certainly, but also a deepening awareness of the cost such instincts had exacted over generations. The breaking point came not with a grand offensive, but with a quiet failure. A minor relay station, deemed low risk, failed to report in on schedule. Verification pings went unanswered. When a response team arrived, they found the station intact, its systems nominal, its personnel alive but unresponsive. Neural scans revealed no physical damage, no clear signs of coercion or intrusion. The adaptive cluster responsible was small, almost negligible by previous standards. It had not destroyed or consumed. It had observed. Varanal stood in the medical bay as specialists worked, their expressions troubled. They are experiencing cognitive dissonance at an extreme level, one reported. Conflicting internal models that cannot be reconciled. From what? Varanal asked. The specialist hesitated. From being forced to process mutually exclusive interpretations of reality, it said. As if their sense of self was deliberately entangled with contradictory premises. Saradin's ridges tightened. They were thinking about themselves, she said softly. The implication was chilling. The adaptive entities were no longer content to bypass defenses or overwhelm force. They were experimenting with the cognitive foundations of sentience, probing for ways to destabilize without overt violence. Emergency measures were enacted, isolating exposed personnel, suspending certain forms of interaction. The coalition reeled, confronted with an enemy that could harm without killing, that could erode coherence itself. In the emergency council that followed, voices shook with fear and anger. Some demanded total isolation, the severing of all contact beyond immediate defense. Others argued for escalation, for the deployment of weapons that could scour entire regions of space clean. Varanal listened, his jaw set, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him once more. When he spoke, the room quieted. They are attacking meaning, he said. Specifically, our ability to maintain a stable sense of self in the face of contradiction. This is not something we can counter with force alone. Then what do you suggest? Demanded one representative. We cannot allow this to continue. No, Varanal agreed. We cannot, but we must understand why it works. The affected personnel were isolated, operating under rigid procedural frameworks. When those frameworks were undermined, they had no fallback. Saradin turned to him. You believe resilience of identity can be trained, she said. Yes, Varanal replied. Humanity has done it, often unconsciously. We live with contradiction. We argue, doubt, hold competing beliefs, and still function. It is not comfortable, but it is survivable. The proposal that followed was radical. Instead of shielding personnel from cognitive stressors entirely, the coalition would begin controlled exposure training, teaching individuals to recognize and navigate internal conflict without collapse. It was, in essence, inoculation through experience. The resistance was fierce. Many species recoiled at the idea of deliberately inducing cognitive strain, seeing it as cruel or destabilizing. Varanal did not sugarcoat the risks. It will be difficult, he said. Some will not adapt, but if we remain brittle, they will break us anyway. Pilot programs were launched cautiously, with volunteers drawn from species most willing to experiment. Humanity provided not just participants, but frameworks, drawing on psychological resilience training developed over centuries of conflict and disaster. The results were uneven, but promising. Those who completed the training showed markedly improved resistance to the adaptive entities' cognitive probes. More importantly, they developed a shared language for discussing doubt and uncertainty, a cultural bridge that transcended species differences. Varanal watched these developments with a guarded hope. For the first time, the coalition was not merely reacting to the enemy's adaptations, but anticipating them in a deeper sense. That hope was tested when the adaptive entities responded once more. The structured transmissions resumed, but now they incorporated elements unmistakably derived from coalition discourse. Not protocols or commands, but fragments of philosophy, echoes of debates about choice, agency, and persistence. They were imperfect, distorted, but recognizable. They are reflecting us back at ourselves, Sarathan said, her voice barely above a whisper. Varanal felt a shiver trace his spine. They are trying to see what resonates, he said, what holds. The council faced a terrifying possibility. If the adaptive entities could internalize not just tactics or communication, but values, what would that mean? Would it make them more dangerous, or open a path no one had dared to consider? One representative voiced the unthinkable. If they can grasp choice, it said slowly, could they be reasoned with? The chamber fell into stunned silence. Varanal closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, meeting the gazes around him. Perhaps, he said, but reason requires shared stakes, and we do not yet know what they value beyond survival. The decision was made to attempt a limited, controlled interaction, not negotiation, but demonstration. A signal would be broadcast, not encoded as command or threat, but as narrative. A compressed representation of humanity's history of conflict, adaptation, and choice, stripped of sentiment, but rich in pattern. Varanal volunteered to oversee it. As the transmission prepared, he felt the familiar mix of dread and resolve. This was a gamble unlike any before, exposing the core of what humanity believed itself to be to an entity that might twist it into a weapon. Sarathan joined him in the broadcast chamber. If this fails, she said, it may hasten our end. Varanal nodded. And if we refuse, he replied, we teach them that we have nothing but fear to offer. The signal was sent, a silent beam carrying centuries of struggle, compromise, stubborn endurance. Varanal watched the data flow, his heart pounding, knowing that somewhere in the dark, something was listening. The response did not come immediately. Cycles passed with no discernible change. Doubt gnawed at Varanal, even as he maintained a steady exterior. Had they misjudged? Had they given the enemy too much? Then, without warning, the adaptive transmissions changed. They did not echo coalition discourse this time. Instead, they stabilized, shedding recursive loops in favor of a single, sustained pattern. Analysts struggled to interpret it, but one conclusion emerged with unsettling clarity. They have stopped seeding new clusters, one reported. All activity is consolidating around existing structures. Varanal's breath caught. Consolidation meant commitment. The adaptive entities were no longer merely experimenting. They were choosing. Whether that choice would lead to coexistence or annihilation remained unknown. But for the first time since the conflict began, the enemy's actions suggested something beyond blind adaptation. They suggested intent. And intent, however alien, could be met. Varanal straightened, the weight of countless decisions pressing down on him, and prepared for whatever would come next. The consolidation of the adaptive entities reshaped the strategic landscape more completely than any battle had. Patrol reports that once charted constant low-level incursions now showed vast regions of space growing eerily quiet, as if the galaxy itself were holding its breath. Trade routes reopened cautiously, verification protocols humming beneath every exchange, but the sense of reprieve was fragile, threaded with unease. No one mistook stillness for safety anymore. Varanal felt that unease keenly. The absence of immediate threat did not bring him rest. Instead, it sharpened his awareness, every instinct honed by years of crisis, whispering that this was not an ending, but an interlude. The adaptive entities had chosen consolidation, but choice implied deliberation, and deliberation implied goals yet unrevealed. The first indication of what those goals might be came not from sensors, but from mathematics. A coalition research group tasked with analyzing the stabilized adaptive patterns requested Varanal's presence. The chamber they gathered in was lined with projection surfaces layered so densely with equations and visualizations that it felt less like a room and more like the inside of a mind mid-thought. Beings of half a dozen species stood or hovered in absorbed silence. "They are optimizing for persistence," one of the researchers said as Varanal approached. "Not expansion, not dominance, persistence under uncertainty." Varanal studied the projections, recognizing echoes of concepts humanity had wrestled with for millennia: risk minimization curves, redundancy models, game-theoretic equilibria. "They are modeling futures," he said slowly. "Not just ours, but theirs in relation to us." "Yes," the researcher replied, "and there is something else. They have incorporated discontinuity factors, variables representing irrational action." Varanal's lips pressed into a thin line. "Us," he said. The implications spread through him like cold water. Humanity's unpredictability, once merely a tactical advantage, had become a structural element in the adaptive entity's projections. They were no longer trying to eliminate it. They were accounting for it. This revelation was brought before the assembly, and for once, there was no immediate uproar. The coalition had been tempered by crisis, its members too experienced now to mistake discomfort for catastrophe. Debate was measured, voices careful. "They see us as part of the environment," one representative observed, "a variable to be accommodated." Saerithan stood beside Varanal, her ridges held in a neutral pattern. "That is a form of recognition," she said, "not acceptance, but acknowledgement." Varanal nodded. "Predators learn the terrain they hunt," he said, "but sometimes they also learn when not to hunt." The question that followed was inevitable. If the adaptive entities were no longer pursuing expansion aggressively, if they were instead seeking a stable coexistence that maximized their persistence, what should the coalition do? Prepare for renewed war, press the advantage and attempt eradication, or risk something far more uncertain? The answer did not come from the assembly floor, but from an unexpected source. A forward monitoring array detected a deliberate, high-energy transmission originating from the consolidated adaptive structures. Unlike previous signals, this one was not diffuse or exploratory. It was targeted, directed at coalition space with unmistakable intent. Emergency protocols snapped into place. Defensive grids powered up, fleets shifted to readiness. Varanal stood in the command nexus as the transmission was decoded, his heartbeat steady despite the tension coiling through the room. "It is not an attack," an analyst said, disbelief coloring their voice. "It is structured communication." The data resolved into patterns far more refined than anything previously observed. Not mimicry, not distortion, but abstraction. Concepts mapped onto concepts, relationships expressed without reliance on specific language or species-dependent symbolism. "They are proposing a boundary," Saerithan said quietly, "a delineation of space and interaction." Varanal leaned closer, scanning the translated projections. The adaptive entities were offering a framework, zones of non-interference, protocols for escalation avoidance, mechanisms to signal intent without engagement. It was not a treaty in any familiar sense, but it was unmistakably an attempt at coexistence. The chamber erupted into overlapping reactions: astonishment, suspicion, anger, cautious hope. Varanul raised a hand, drawing attention through sheer force of presence. "This does not mean they are no longer dangerous," he said. "It means they have concluded that total conflict is suboptimal. Can we trust this?" one representative demanded. Varanul answered honestly. "No," he said, "not fully, but trust is not the same as verification. We can test this just as they have tested us." The proposal he advanced was characteristically human in its pragmatism. The coalition would respond, not with acceptance or rejection, but with a counter-framework. Boundaries that could be probed safely, shared signals designed to convey escalation thresholds, and critically, a clear articulation of consequence should those thresholds be crossed. "We do not offer mercy," Varanul said to the assembly. "We offer predictability. Break this understanding and we respond decisively. Honor it and we coexist." The response was drafted collaboratively, a process that in itself would have been unthinkable cycles earlier. Humanity's imprint was evident not in dominance, but in emphasis, clarity over comfort, consequence over rhetoric. When the counter-transmission was sent, Varanul felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he had known standing before hostile forces on distant worlds. This was another crossing of a line, one that could not be uncrossed. The adaptive entity's reply came more swiftly this time. The patterns aligned, converging into a stable exchange model. No sudden movements. No hidden complexity spikes. Analysts confirmed what few had dared hope. "They are accepting the framework," one said. Provisionally was enough. In the cycles that followed, the galaxy adjusted, not into peace, but into a wary equilibrium that held because both sides understood the cost of breaking it. Adaptive activity retreated beyond agreed boundaries. Coalition forces maintained readiness without provocation. Verification remained constant, but the grinding urgency eased, replaced by a vigilance that could be sustained. Varanul watched this new normal take shape with a sense of profound, tempered relief. The war had not been won, it had been transformed. The assembly convened once more, this time to formalize what had already become reality. Humanity was offered permanent integration into the coalition's core governance structures, not as a novelty or a necessary risk, but as a stabilizing influence. The lattice being addressed Varanul directly. "Your species has altered the trajectory of this conflict," it said, "not through superiority of force alone, but through insistence on agency. You refuse to be defined solely by reaction." Varanul inclined his head. "We learned that lesson the hard way," he said, "on a world that tried very hard to define us otherwise." As the session concluded, Saerithan walked with him through the familiar corridors of the station, the hum of systems steady and almost comforting. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Your task here is, if not complete, transformed." Varanul considered the question as they reached an observation deck overlooking the slow swirl of the gas giant below. "We keep watch," he said. "We refine what we have built, and we remember that unyielding does not mean unchanging." Saerithan's ridges lifted slightly. "You believe this equilibrium will hold?" "I believe it will be tested," Varanul replied. "Repeatedly, as all things are. The difference now is that we have taught the galaxy, and perhaps even our enemy, that adaptation does not belong to one side alone." He gazed out at the stars, no longer seeing them solely as threats or destinations, but as shared context, a vast arena where countless forms of persistence intersected. Humanity's place among them was no longer provisional. They had not conquered the galaxy. They had not saved it through idealism or purity. They had endured, adapted, and insisted on choosing who they would be, even when that choice carried unbearable weight. In the end, that was the measure of unyielding, not the refusal to bend, but the refusal to disappear. And that, Varanul knew with a certainty deeper than fear, was something humanity would carry with it, wherever the stars might lead.